They don't want you to know this. And when I say they, I'm talking about a force that has shaped what you believe since childhood. Because the truth is brutal, there are books that were ripped out of the Bible, and the reason is terrifying. Texts that speak of fallen angels, secret cults, prophetic dreams, and even detailed visions of hell. All of it was deliberately hidden. Banned. Burned. Silenced. But why? Because these terrifying books reveal what no altar ever wanted you to uncover. That the sacred story was edited, manipulated, pruned. And the most disturbing part? These books exist, and in this video, you're going to discover every single one of them. From the Book of Giants to the Gospel of Judas, from Satan's altar to the cults that claim to follow Jesus through unthinkable rituals. You'll dive into a truth that will shake everything you thought you knew about faith. And in the end, only one question will matter. Why did they hide this from you for so long? Some stories were never meant for everyone's ears. Or at least, that's what they want you to believe. The truth is, the terrifying books that were deliberately banned from the Bible didn't disappear by accident. Entire passages, cryptic accounts, and prophetic visions were left out of the holy book out of convenience. And the burning question is, what exactly were they trying to hide? The journey you're about to begin isn't for everyone, it's for those who are ready to lift the veil, break the silence, and dive deep into the shadowy depths of biblical history. A path where mystery isn't the exception, it's the rule. Behind the curtains of organized religion, there are secrets that shake even the most devoted scholars. Can you imagine that disturbing Gospels once portrayed Jesus in a way completely different from what we've been taught? Or that there are prophetic dreams deemed too dangerous to be shared with the public? And we're not talking about fiction. These are real documents, translated and authenticated by archaeologists and theologians. Think about it, why were such powerful, detailed books simply ignored? What makes these texts so threatening? These terrifying books, now labeled apocryphal or even heretical, speak of celestial wars, fallen gods, entities walking among men, and prophecies that may still be unfolding. Reading them feels like uncovering a parallel history, one that still connects deeply with everything we thought we knew about the Bible. They're like missing puzzle pieces. And like any missing piece, they leave behind an unsettling feeling. The same unease you've probably felt when reading certain verses and thinking, this doesn't feel complete. That's where prophetic dreams come into play. In many ancient cultures, dreams weren't just symbolic, they were considered direct messages from the divine. Take the dreams of Enoch, for example, which spoke of global catastrophes, celestial visitors, and universal judgments. These records don't just challenge the traditional narrative, they carry a disturbing sense that something greater is happening behind the scenes. And maybe the most curious part is this: why were these revelations feared so deeply? Fear of chaos? Or fear of awakening? Here's a detail few people know. Certain religious councils argued intensely over which books should be included or excluded from the Bible. And believe it or not, it wasn't just about theology. Many texts were banned for having too much power. That's right. Some terrifying books gave readers a sense of spiritual autonomy that threatened existing systems of control. One example: Gospels where Jesus taught that the kingdom of God was within you, no intermediaries needed. A statement like that doesn't just break dogma, it challenges centuries of hierarchy. And that's exactly what makes this journey so necessary: to question, to investigate, to deconstruct. Because every banned book is like an echo from a past that still pulses, waiting to be rediscovered. And every forgotten page might be the key to something far greater. After all, if the secrets were hidden, maybe that's where the true power of revelation lies. And speaking of revelations, get ready, because what comes next will shake everything you think you know about the giants in the Bible. Imagine opening an ancient manuscript and coming face to face with accounts of colossal beings, born from the union between celestial entities and human women. This isn't a work of fiction, it's the content of the Book of Giants, one of the terrifying books that were banned from the Bible and later rediscovered among the Dead Sea Scrolls. This pseudepigraphic text leads us through a narrative that feels more like a hidden denunciation, the existence of the Nephilim, hybrid beings, born from the transgressions of angels known as the Watchers. But why exactly was this story hidden from the world for so long? The Watchers, according to this narrative, were angels sent to earth with the mission to observe humanity. But they were seduced by the beauty of human women, and from that forbidden act came the Nephilim. Gigantic, intelligent, and violent creatures who corrupted the earth. It reads like myth, yet striking parallels appear in Sumerian texts, Hindu epics, and even indigenous traditions. It's as if the idea of beings between heaven and earth is etched into the collective memory of humanity. Even more intriguing are the prophetic dreams described in the Book of Giants, visions foretelling the Great Flood as divine punishment for the corruption caused by the Watchers and their offspring. And then enters Enoch, one of the most enigmatic figures in the Bible. According to the text, he was chosen to deliver the warning of impending doom to the fallen angels. Interestingly, this same Enoch has an entire book attributed to him, also banned, detailing celestial journeys and encounters with divine entities. Coincidence? Or a deliberate pattern of exclusion? Manichaeism, a powerful ancient syncretic religion, embraced the Book of Giants as part of its doctrine. This shows the text held real theological weight, enough to be considered sacred by influential religious traditions. Yet while some embraced it, others labeled it as dangerous heresy. Why? Perhaps because it exposed a disruptive truth, that higher beings can also fall, rebel, and cause catastrophic consequences. This challenges the image of divine perfection and shakes the foundations of infallible authority. Now think about this: if the Bible were a movie, the Book of Giants would be the dark spin-off, revealing the forbidden backstory. A version of the fall that includes not just humans, but the celestial beings themselves. And of course, that doesn't sit well with a narrative built on order, purity, and obedience. Removing this book from the canon may have been more about control than doctrine. A way to stop people from asking the wrong questions, uncomfortable questions about the origin of evil and the accountability of heaven. And if, even centuries later, we're still reading, discussing, and searching for these terrifying books banned from the Bible, maybe it's because, deep down, we sense the official story has too many holes. And it's in those gaps that the most disturbing secrets hide. Speaking of secrets, the next one isn't found in a manuscript, but in stone. A colossal structure with Satan's name carved into its very foundation. Let's now walk through the shadowy halls of a revelation that blends archaeology with the apocalypse. There are places that carry a strange energy. You can't see it, but you can feel it. And among such places, few are as enigmatic as the ancient city of Pergamon. Amid its ruins lies what the Book of Revelation itself calls the throne of Satan. Yes, you read that right. This is no metaphor. John of Patmos, in his apocalyptic visions, explicitly refers to this location as the place where Satan dwells. And when we examine the history of the great altar of Pergamon, the connections begin to form an unsettling picture, the kind that the terrifying books banned from the Bible would avoid explaining. The great altar of Pergamon was a majestic structure dedicated to Zeus, the supreme god of the Greek pantheon. But it wasn't just a site for pagan worship, it was also the stage for brutal persecutions of the early Christians. Among the martyrs was Antipas, mentioned in Revelation as, "my faithful witness." According to records, he was burned alive inside a bronze bull, a ritualistic execution. A punishment that seems not merely political, but deeply spiritual, almost as if part of a dark liturgy. John of Patmos, who wrote Revelation while in exile, didn't use his words lightly. He wasn't simply referring to a random pagan city. He was pointing to a physical structure, a real location that represented something much deeper. When he calls Pergamon the throne of Satan, he's drawing a spiritual and symbolic map. And this is where it all ties back to the idea that certain terrifying books were banned to conceal uncomfortable truths. Because when religion, empire, and occultism intertwine, the result is explosive. Some believe that when the altar of Pergamon was transported to Germany in the 19th century, and meticulously reconstructed, it caused an energetic displacement. Hitler himself is said to have delivered iconic speeches in front of structures inspired by that very altar. Coincidence? Maybe. But in a world where symbols carry more weight than words, ancient places of worship can become modern platforms for dangerous ideologies. It casts new light on the idea that certain places carry a presence. And now consider this. Why would John call that place the throne of Satan? Why not another temple? Why not another altar? The answer lies in the type of worship that took place there, a fusion of political power, human sacrifice, and divine cult. The same pattern that appears in other terrifying books, those that detail how dark entities infiltrate systems that appear holy on the surface. And that leads us to a question few dare to ask. What if this fusion between religion and domination is exactly what has kept certain truths buried in the shadows? Maybe that's why Revelation isn't just a book about the end. It's a book about unveiling. Revealing what has always been hidden, under stones, under sacred names, under unquestionable dogmas. And speaking of uncomfortable revelations, it's time to return to the very heart of the Bible. Because the divide between what's sacred and what's heretical began long before Pergamon. And all of it ties into one ancient, unresolved debate. What was truly meant to be within the pages of the Bible? Very few people know this, but the Bible as we know it today didn't fall from the sky fully formed and bound. Quite the opposite, it's the result of heated disputes, councils, political interests, and strategic decisions. And one of the most revealing chapters in this story involves the so-called deuterocanonical books, texts accepted by part of Christianity and rejected by another. Here, once again, we see books being banned, excluded, hidden. As if the truth had multiple versions depending on who's telling the story. And so, the inevitable question arises. Who had the power to decide what is divine word, and what is not? In the Catholic Bible, we find books like Tobit, Judith, Wisdom, Sirach, and 1 and 2 Maccabees, all considered deuterocanonical. But in the Protestant Bible, these books are simply not there. Why? The answer begins with the Protestant Reformation, when Martin Luther chose to revise the canon, challenging any books that weren't found in the Hebrew version of the Old Testament. But here's the catch, the Hebrew Bible itself was already a selection. Meaning it was a choice based on another choice. A long game of exclusions and inclusions that shaped centuries of faith. The early Christians, for example, used the Septuagint, a Greek translation of the Old Testament that included all these books. This version was widely accepted, even by some New Testament authors. Later came the Vulgate, translated by Saint Jerome under the commission of Pope Damasus I, which also preserved the deuterocanonical books. So for a long time, these texts were considered legitimate scripture. They weren't apocryphal, they weren't suspicious. They were Bible. And that changes everything. Because it shows that the terrifying books banned from the Bible weren't always banned. They were once read, revered, and preached. Their exclusion came when Luther, seeking to reinforce the doctrine of sola scriptura, removed the books that, in his view, didn't perfectly align with his interpretation of faith. In fact, he even wanted to remove Hebrews, James, Jude, and Revelation, but eventually backed down. Now imagine, if even New Testament books were nearly discarded. What does that say about the fragility of these criteria? And what else might have been left out? This is why exploring the banned books of the Bible is not about rebellion. It's about intellectual honesty. Why were certain texts that speak of the intercession of saints, prayer for the dead, or the power of feminine wisdom discarded? Because they didn't fit the new narrative. The Bible became a dogmatic construction, adjusted to the preferences of those in power. And in that process, much was removed, powerful things, even dangerous ones. You see, these terrifying books weren't simply forgotten. They were deliberately removed. With intent, with purpose. As if, by extinguishing certain lights, darkness could be more easily controlled. And that's exactly where the real discomfort lies. If some books were excluded because they empowered the individual too much, are we reading what we should read? Or only what we were allowed to read? Perhaps the impact of this manipulation becomes even clearer when we examine those who tried to erase certain texts completely from history. Like a man who turned his hatred for one biblical book into an actual policy of extermination. And his name? You know it all too well. It may seem unlikely, but one of the terrifying books most hated by Adolf Hitler wasn't a revolutionary manifesto or a political tract. It was the Book of Esther. One of the few books in the Bible where the name of God doesn't even appear. That alone is intriguing. But what deeply disturbed the Nazi regime was something far more symbolic. Esther represents the victory of a persecuted people over their oppressor. And for someone in the role of the oppressor, that message is utterly intolerable. The story of Esther revolves around the courage of a Jewish woman who becomes queen of Persia and, through strategy and boldness, prevents the genocide of her people. A key figure in the plot is Mordecai, her cousin and mentor, who uncovers a conspiracy led by Haman, the king's right hand, who sought to annihilate the Jews. In the end, Haman is hanged on the very gallows he built for Mordecai. And that twist of fate is a slap in the face to any authoritarian regime. Hitler knew it. And he hated it. During the Third Reich, the Book of Esther was harshly criticized by Nazi ideologues. Why? Because it exalted Jewish resistance, unity, and, above all, the idea that a woman, through intelligence, could change the course of history. In Nazi speeches and documents, Esther was painted as a symbol of Semitic cunning. A twisted, anti-Semitic interpretation that revealed just how terrified authoritarian systems are of liberation narratives. That's why this book became a kind of ghost within Christianity aligned with Nazism. And this case reveals something essential. The books banned from the Bible, or those attacked and marginalized, often carry messages of liberation, resistance, and courage. They are not neutral texts. They are tools of awareness. In this sense, the Bible ceases to be merely a religious collection and becomes a symbolic battleground. A place where the meaning of stories can either strengthen or weaken an entire population. And when a narrative empowers the oppressed, it becomes dangerous to the oppressors. What makes the Book of Esther even more powerful is the absence of miracles or divine interventions. Everything unfolds through human action, through choices, courage, and risk. It's as if the book is saying, faith without action is inertia. And that strikes something deep in the reader. Maybe that's why, in certain historical contexts, it was seen as troublesome. Because it shows that even in silence, even without divine intervention, the people can rewrite their own story. And that idea, for authoritarian regimes, is unbearable. And so we continue to uncover the ripple effects of these terrifying books banned from the Bible. Not just in spirituality, but in politics, identity, and the historical memory of entire peoples. But if you found this case of biblical censorship and hatred surprising, wait until you discover a gospel that reveals the childhood of Jesus in a way you've never imagined. Get ready. The next banned book shatters dogmas from the very first page. If the official story of Jesus begins in Bethlehem with the visit of the Magi, the proto-evangelium of James takes us even further back. To the birth and childhood of Mary herself, the mother of Jesus. This infancy gospel, banned from the biblical canon, is one of the terrifying books that continues to intrigue both scholars and believers to this day. And not because it contains anything evil, but because it reveals details that dismantle simplified narratives and open the door to much deeper, and perhaps even sublime, interpretations of Christian spirituality. According to the text, Mary was miraculously conceived by Anna and Joachim, consecrated to the temple from a young age, and raised in absolute purity. She is said to have received celestial revelations even before Jesus' conception. And the birth of the Messiah was witnessed by mystical signs. The entire natural world reportedly paused at the very moment of his birth. The text emphasizes Mary's perpetual virginity, a claim still debated today, and portrays Joseph not as a young husband, but as an older widower, chosen to be the guardian of the girl pledged to divine service. These details completely reshape the narrative many have grown up with. The Proto-Evangelium of James doesn't simply tell a story, it seeks to explain it. And that's where the problem lies. Because a text that goes too deep can also ask too many questions. Perhaps that's why it was banned from the Bible. After all, when you give context and humanity to sacred characters, you bring the divine closer to the earthly. And that has always been uncomfortable for institutions that prefer to keep mystery under control. Another reason this gospel is one of the most controversial, terrifying books is its connection to Gnosticism. Some interpretations describe the birth of Jesus as a purely spiritual event. No pain, no blood, no physical contact. A kind of alchemical birth. This clashes directly with the realism favored by the early church fathers. At the same time, it resonates with mystical Eastern traditions that see divine birth as a vibrational process. Such ideas, during the formation of Orthodox Christianity, were considered dangerous, and quickly excluded. Yet despite official rejection, the Proto-Evangelium of James was a success among early Christians. Monks, mystics, and devotees of Mary read it with reverence. It inspired works of art, prayers, and even doctrinal developments, including the Immaculate Conception. In other words, what was banned from the Bible continued to echo through popular culture and the faith of millions. Proving that some books are banned, but never erased. They survive in the details, in the paintings, in the corners of cathedrals. And when they resurface, they bring with them a force that's hard to contain. And if even the story of the mother of Jesus was shaped by political and theological choices, imagine what else has been manipulated within the pages of faith. Because the next case doesn't deal with something ancient, but with a cruel chapter from modern history. A Bible rewritten, edited, mutilated. Not for doctrinal reasons, but as a tool of oppression. Prepare yourself to uncover the shocking story of the slave Bible. There are chapters in history that ache in the soul. And few are as shocking as that of the so-called slave Bible. One of the most terrifying books ever perversely edited in human history. Imagine a sacred book, a symbol of faith and liberation, being transformed into a tool of submission and control. That's exactly what happened in the British West Indies, where Christian missionaries rewrote the Bible, removing crucial sections before handing it to enslaved Africans. The goal? To erase every trace of hope, rebellion, or freedom. The original slave Bible contained only about 10% of the Old Testament and 50% of the New Testament. Books like Exodus, where Moses leads his enslaved people to freedom, were carefully removed. The message was clear. Obey your master, for this is God's will. Passages that spoke of justice, equality, or the liberating love of Christ were mercilessly cut out. And what remained? A distorted narrative where submission and passivity were portrayed as divine virtues. This brutal example shows how even the Bible can be used as a weapon. Not because of its original content, but because of how it can be manipulated. When a sacred text is edited to exclude freedom and glorify slavery, it stops being the Word of God and becomes a tool of oppression. This specific edition was used for centuries to justify Christian slavery. And when we look at it with discerning eyes, one unavoidable question arises. How many other editions have been made, more subtly, to shape minds? Perhaps the most disturbing part is realizing this Bible wasn't a mistake. It was part of a system. A mechanism of control in which the sacred was turned into a shackle. The enslaved were taught to read, but only what they were allowed to read. And if they dared to question, they were punished with violence. This practice makes it painfully clear. The banned books of the Bible aren't always ancient texts. Sometimes, they are entire sections deliberately ripped out. And when that happens, it's not just the text that disappears. It's truth itself that gets rewritten. The story of the slave Bible reminds us that imposed silence is as powerful as the noise of oppression. When access to the full word is denied, so is the right to think freely. And don't think this is just history. Even today, there are efforts to filter what may or may not be read, believed, or felt. That's why studying these terrifying books banned from the Bible is an act of conscious rebellion. A step toward true knowledge, soul freedom, and a connection with the divine without censorship. And if even the book of salvation was used as a shackle, what can we say about a text that vividly describes the torments of hell and the ecstasies of heaven? A book once as popular as the Gospels, but buried for revealing too much. Get ready, because what comes next is a vivid journey through the depths and glories of eternity. The apocalypse you were never meant to read. Have you ever wondered what it would be like to see heaven and hell with your own eyes? The Apocalypse of Peter is one of the most terrifying books ever written, visceral, graphic, and raw. And it was precisely because of that intensity that it was banned from the Bible. This apocalyptic text, widely read in the early centuries of Christianity, offers detailed visions of heavenly rewards and infernal punishment so specific they read like a blend between a horror film and a spiritual documentary. And the most astonishing part? For a time, this gospel was more widely read than the book of Revelation itself. The descriptions of hell are brutal. Thieves hanging by their fingers from iron hooks, adulterers suspended over eternal flames, liars having their tongues ripped out by angels of punishment. These are not metaphors. The text is blunt, almost shocking. Yet despite its intensity, it served a clear purpose. To educate through fear. To vividly portray the spiritual consequences of human actions. A message that made sense in a time when faith needed to be visual, almost tangible, to leave a deep impression on believers. But perhaps what disturbed religious authorities the most wasn't just the content, but the tone. The Apocalypse of Peter offered a more intense, more personal, more direct spiritual experience. Reading it felt like seeing the spiritual world through your own eyes. And that sense of spiritual autonomy was unsettling. After all, the more someone feels they can access the divine on their own, the less they rely on intermediaries or institutions. And that brings us back to the old question. Were these terrifying books banned because they were heretical? Or because they offered too much independence? Beyond the horrors of hell, heaven is described in equally vivid terms. Flowered fields, rivers of milk and honey, lights dancing in the sky like visible music. The contrast with the torment of the damned is so striking that the text reads like an urgent invitation to transformation. And that's the key. The Apocalypse of Peter wasn't just meant to scare. It was a call to consciousness. A powerful reminder that our choices echo far beyond this life. A tool for awakening. And texts that awaken too much often end up silenced. What's fascinating is that even after it was removed from the official canon, this gospel continued to influence Christian iconography for centuries. Many of the images of hell found in medieval Europe were inspired by this text. It shaped how good and evil were depicted in churches, sermons, and even art. Which proves that, although it was banned from the Bible, it never truly disappeared. It remained, a sacred shadow that insists on returning when the light fades. And if you thought this immersion into the fate of souls was intense, prepare yourself for something even more disturbing. A secret sect that claimed to follow the teachings of Jesus, but practiced rituals so bizarre they would make anyone question the sanity of its leaders. The next books weren't just banned. They were hidden as if they carried spiritual poison. Are you ready to discover the Borborites? Now we enter truly forbidden territory. The Borborites are not just a footnote in early Christian history. They are a pulsing enigma, a Gnostic sect that took the concept of transcendence to its absolute extreme. Their sacred texts are among the most disturbing ever recorded. These are banned books not only from the Bible, but from collective consciousness itself. Because they contain teachings and practices that defy every traditional sense of morality. It's as if they tore the pages of reality and rewrote their own version of the sacred. And the result is, to say the least, unsettling. This sect claimed to follow the teachings of Jesus, but interpreted everything through a radical Gnostic lens. To the Borborites, the body was a prison, and pleasure, a path to liberation. So far, this might sound like an alternative philosophy. But their rituals involved both symbolic and literal acts of transgression. Historical accounts, mostly from their opponents, describe ceremonies where bodily fluids were consumed as sacrament. Yes, you read that right. What would be unthinkable today was, for them, a method to dissolve the illusions of matter and access the spirit. Among their sacred texts were the Gospel of Eve, the Apocalypse of Adam, the Gospel of Perfection, and the Questions of Mary. These terrifying books explored themes like the fall of the archons, the awakening of the divine spark trapped in flesh, and a Jesus who spoke in riddles and revealed secret teachings only to initiated disciples. It's a narrative entirely different from that of the canonical Gospels. And perhaps for that very reason, so feared. Because it shakes the foundations. It redefines what is right, what is sacred, what is allowed. Gnosticism as a whole was already a threat to orthodoxy. But the Borborites went even further. They didn't just read banned books of the Bible. They wrote their own. Their doctrines challenged the idea of a benevolent creator. To them, the creator God was a limited demiurge. And the true God was beyond all this, pure light and ineffable. This turned the entire structure of Christian theology on its head. Think about it. If the world is a prison, and the body is a cage, then all systems of power based on morality, sin, and punishment, collapse. Of course, much of what we know about the Borborites comes from their enemies, like Epiphanius of Salamis. So exaggerations and distortions are likely. But the fact remains. They existed. They influenced. And they left a trace. Even their name, Borborites, from Borboros, meaning filth, in Greek, was a slur. An insult meant to discredit and degrade. And yet, despite this label, their idea survived, in manuscripts and fragments that, although banned from the Bible, are still studied in universities and Gnostic theological circles today. And if this group dared to reinterpret the divine so radically, it may not be a coincidence that one of the most controversial texts in Christian history emerged from the same Gnostic current. A gospel where the greatest traitor of all time may have never betrayed anyone at all. Next, you'll uncover the forbidden vision of Judas Iscariot, and what he may have truly represented in Jesus' divine plan. Are you ready to have your mind challenged? Because the Gospel of Judas does exactly that. It turns upside down the most well-known narrative of the Bible, the betrayal of Jesus. Without a doubt, this is one of the most terrifying books ever discovered, controversial, unsettling, and deeply thought-provoking. Instead of portraying Judas Iscariot as a traitor driven by greed, this text reveals him as Jesus' closest disciple, the only one who truly understood the Master's divine plan, and had the courage to carry out the darkest mission, to hand Jesus over so he could fulfill his destiny. That twist changes everything. In the Gospel of Judas, written under Gnostic influence, Jesus laughs at the other apostles for failing to comprehend his true nature. Only Judas receives the secret knowledge, the final revelation. Jesus chooses him, confides in him, and asks him to carry out the plan. Not as a betrayer, but as an essential collaborator. A perspective that completely redefines our understanding of sacrifice, guilt, and redemption. And of course, it shakes the very foundations of Christian tradition. The discovery of this manuscript, published with the support of National Geographic in 2006, sent shockwaves through both academic and religious circles. Translated from a 3rd century copy, the Gospel introduces us to a mystical, almost esoteric Jesus. A teacher who speaks of higher realms, of eons and archons, and of a hidden reality behind creation. His worldview aligns more closely with Gnostic cosmology and diverges dramatically from official church theology. The result? The text was swiftly labeled heretical, and, once again, banned from the Bible. Now think with me. What if Judas's betrayal was actually an act of loyalty? A personal sacrifice in the name of something greater? This idea disturbs, because it forces us to look at the duality of good and evil with more nuance. After all, not everything that looks like betrayal is. And not every villain is what they appear to be. That's one of the greatest provocations of the banned books. They shake the foundations of established morality, inviting the reader to think for themselves, to question what has been taught as absolute truth. And if this were true, what would happen to the role of the church? Of salvation? Of sin? These are uncomfortable questions, and perhaps they explain why the Gospel of Judas was hidden for so many centuries. After all, it's not easy to accept that history might have been told from a single perspective, while other, equally ancient and profound accounts were silenced. This book was literally buried, to ensure no one would ever access that version of the story. But as always, what is buried eventually resurfaces. And speaking of buried mysteries, how about a secret excavation, cloaked in silence, in the birthplace of one of Christianity's greatest figures? Tarsus, the city of Paul, hid for years a covert operation. And rumors say the Vatican had its eye on something that could change everything we know about the New Testament. Now we step into the realm of shadows. Not of forgotten texts, but of silent excavations, shrouded in secrecy, where no words are spoken, and secrets are buried. Tarsus, the birthplace of St. Paul, one of the most influential figures in Christianity, became the stage for a mysterious excavation between 2006 and 2010. Officially, little is known. But among scholars and theorists, whispers circulate. What they were searching for wasn't just history, but something far more valuable, a lost manuscript. Perhaps even Paul's own Bible. An original document that could rewrite everything we know about the New Testament. What caused the real stir wasn't just the dig itself. It was the behavior surrounding it. A restricted zone. No public statements. And the involvement of figures tied to the Vatican. For those familiar with church history, this isn't new. Whenever something arises that could shake the foundations of faith, a book, a relic, a symbol, silence becomes the first line of defense. But why such fear around a supposed manuscript? Because, if it were real, it might prove that Paul's letters were edited over time. Or that some may not have been written by him at all. Now imagine the impact. Paul authored the majority of the New Testament. His writings shaped Christian doctrine, church structure, sexual morality, the role of women, the concept of sin. If an original version were uncovered and revealed contradictions, omissions, or even opposing guidance, it would trigger a seismic shift in institutional Christianity. That would make this potential discovery one of the most terrifying books of all. The kind that shakes the very foundation of the altar itself. Of course, we are stepping into speculative territory. But every conspiracy theory begins with an informational void. And in this case, the silence was intentional. Local authorities offered no explanations, no findings were disclosed. And media access was severely restricted. Some independent archaeologists suggest that a non-canonical version of Paul's teachings may have been found. Perhaps one closer to the Essenes than to the Roman Church. And let's be honest, that's not something the Vatican would eagerly share. These narratives push us toward a disturbing reflection. What if the faith we know was built on political selections and institutional interests? We're not saying everything is false. But perhaps not everything was told. What is silenced still holds weight. And maybe that's why these banned books of the Bible, even when inaccessible, remain alive in the imagination and intuition of those who seek truth. Because truth doesn't die. It simply changes location. And if you think that sounds surreal, just wait until you hear about another text. Even older, even more symbolic. A book that describes Abraham himself refusing to accept death. And what that reveals about fear, destiny, and the true role of angels in the final passage. Are you ready to discover the testament of Abraham? Among all the biblical patriarchs, Abraham is perhaps the most revered. But there is one book, one of the most forgotten and poetic, terrifying books, that reveals a completely different side of this iconic figure. A man who refused to die. The Testament of Abraham, an apocryphal text considered sacred by some branches of Eastern Christianity, tells an extraordinary story in which the patriarch simply says, "No," when death knocks at his door. Simple, direct, and completely unacceptable to traditional canon, which always treated death as an unquestionable divine decree. In the text, God sends the archangel Michael to retrieve Abraham's soul. But instead of accepting his time with humble obedience, Abraham resists. He asks for more time. He questions. He demands explanations. In other words, he acts like a fully conscious human being, curious, aware, engaged. Not just a passive piece in some celestial game. And that changes everything. It shows that even God's chosen ones have the right to question. And perhaps that's why this book was banned. Because it reveals that a real relationship with the divine includes doubt, resistance, and spiritual autonomy. Throughout the story, Abraham is guided by Michael through visions of life and death, witnessing how souls are judged, how good and evil are weighed. This spiritual journey echoes modern near-death experiences described by so many today. He sees angels, demons, portals, symbolic scales. All of it written centuries before such ideas became widespread in mystical traditions. What's most striking is the sensitivity of the writing. A blend of sacred fantasy, moral philosophy, and raw humanity. A quiet invitation to reflect on what it means to live, and how one might choose to die. This book also reveals a surprisingly charming and almost comedic side of Abraham. He insists, negotiates, and even tries to escape his fate. And within that lightness lies one of its deepest secrets. Even the great spiritual masters feel fear. Even the fathers of faith tremble before the unknown. It humanizes spirituality in a powerful way, bringing us closer to the essence of what it means to have a soul. The Testament of Abraham doesn't preach dogma. It speaks of journey, of choice, and of the quiet beauty at the end of a cycle. The Beta Israel community, the Ethiopian Jews, preserved this text for centuries with deep respect. To them, it wasn't a banned book of the Bible. It was a hidden gem. A reminder that faith and consciousness must walk together. Today, the text is studied in universities as part of intertestamental literature. That mysterious space between the Old and New Testaments. Like a hallway between two worlds. And it is in that hallway that much wisdom was forgotten. But if the story of Abraham shows us someone who dares to question his own fate, the next theme takes us even deeper into the shadow side of spirituality. We'll leave the prophets behind and draw closer to those who sought power through pacts with the devil himself. Real men with documented stories, who traded their souls for knowledge, fame, and influence. And believe me, you know more of their names than you think. If the terrifying books banned from the Bible reveal hidden truths, then the stories of pacts with the devil reveal another side of the occult. Humanity's relentless desire for absolute power. Throughout history, certain names have emerged. Figures who crossed the boundaries of faith and morality. Willing to do the unthinkable. Trade their souls for knowledge, fame, or dominion. And these are not just isolated legends. Some of these individuals truly existed, with historical records, formal accusations, and even public executions. The mystery here is real. And so are the consequences. One of the most famous cases is Niccolò Paganini, the Italian violinist whose supernatural talent led many to believe he had made a demonic pact. His dark stare, unnaturally long fingers, and the way he played, as if conversing with invisible entities, only fueled the myth. But Paganini was not alone. John Fian, a Scottish schoolmaster accused of witchcraft, confessed under torture to having signed the Devil's Book. And Jonathan Faustus, the literary figure inspired by real individuals, became the ultimate symbol of a soul sold in exchange for infinite knowledge. And what about Pope Sylvester II? Yes, a pope. According to medieval accounts, he studied necromancy and occult sciences in Seville, and came into possession of a forbidden book, a text that allegedly helped him rise to the top of the church with the aid of infernal forces. Another chilling figure is Urbain Grandier, a French priest accused of demonic pacts during the mass possessions in Loudun. He was burned alive, accused of summoning demons in pursuit of lust and ambition. These cases show that not even the holiest of altars are immune to the temptation of the abyss. But the list goes on. Audre Snorreson, an Icelandic monk said to have written accounts of pacts and shape-shifting. Bernard Foch, the sailor who inspired the Flying Dutchman myth, cursed to sail eternally after selling his soul for speed. Jonathan Moulton, an American general rumored to have bargained with the devil for endless gold. His body later found with burned-out boots from the inside. And perhaps the most sinister of all, Gilles de Rais, a French nobleman and comrade of Joan of Arc, condemned for ritualistic murders in pursuit of infernal power. As unbelievable as these stories may seem, they all share something in common: a fascination with the forbidden, a hunger to transcend human limits, the desire to control reality at any cost. And that leaves us with a powerful lesson. The danger lies not only in the pact, but in what one is willing to sacrifice to get what they desire. The banned books of the Bible often warn of this: that not everything that shines is light, that knowledge without wisdom can lead straight into the abyss, and that the price of unchecked ambition may be nothing less than the soul itself. Now imagine what happens when, instead of one dark figure, we enter a universe full of them. Celestial and infernal beings, with ancient names and specific functions, moving between mythology, religion, and occultism. In the next chapter, you'll meet the most mysterious entities of the spiritual world, those that inspire fear, devotion, and reverence. Angels and demons, side by side, hidden between the lines of the invisible. When we look at the terrifying books banned from the Bible, one thing becomes clear: the spiritual world is far more populated and complex than we were taught. Beyond the generic angels and demons mentioned in sermons and films, there are names, entities with personalities, stories, hierarchies, and specific functions. And it is in this territory that the mystery deepens. Because by naming these beings, ancient traditions were not just acknowledging their existence. They were admitting their direct influence in the world of men. Among the oldest and most feared demons is Pazuzu, the storm spirit from Mesopotamia who crossed religious boundaries and entered modern cinema, as in The Exorcist. Then there is Beelzebub, the Lord of the Flies, appearing in biblical and demonological records as a high-ranking infernal prince. Another powerful name is Abaddon, the Destroyer, mentioned in Revelation as the leader of the Abyss's armies. Each of them is more than just a legend. They are living symbols of chaos, decay, and subtle temptation. On the other side, among the beings of light, stands the majestic Archangel Gabriel, the divine messenger who announced the births of Christ and John the Baptist. Gabriel is the bridge between the divine and the human, between prophecy and the present moment. There is also Raphael, the healer, known in the Book of Tobit as a spiritual guide and guardian. And Chamuel, the Archangel of Love, rarely mentioned but present in Kabbalistic traditions. Who restores relationships and aligns hearts with divine purpose. Each archangel carries a specific vibration, almost like a spiritual frequency working behind the scenes of life. But not all names are so well known. Entities like Adramelech, once worshipped in ancient Assyria as a sun god and later demonized in occult texts, reveal how thin the line can be between angel and demon, often a matter of perspective. Or Gadriel, one of the fallen watchers from the Book of Enoch, accused of teaching humans how to make weapons. An angel who lost his place for trying to illuminate humanity before the appointed time. And what of Choronzon, an entity of chaos, invoked in occult rituals, and associated with mental fragmentation and disintegration? It is within this cauldron that the pantheon of the invisible takes shape. These beings are not confined to ancient texts. They appear in dreams, in visions, in mystical experiences reported by thousands of people around the world. Their names are invoked in magic, in spiritual protection, and even in exorcisms. And as unsettling as it may be, they have a real impact on the collective psyche. Modern occultism, Kabbalah, angelology, and demonology study these forces with seriousness. And those with eyes to see understand. There is far more between heaven and earth than dogma has ever explained. And that's why many of these names were banned from the Bible. Because to acknowledge them is to admit that the game is much bigger than we thought. That forces are at war behind the veil. That spirituality is a symbolic battleground, where knowledge is often more powerful than blind faith. And after all of this, after so much revelation, only one question remains. What will you do with all of this? And that is where we enter the conclusion of this journey. But not without first provoking your soul to awaken to something even deeper. After everything you've seen, do you still believe you truly know the Bible? Or are you starting to realize that the story of faith was told only by those who had the power to edit what you were allowed to know? The truth is, these terrifying books banned from the Bible weren't erased by accident. They were ripped out, because they awaken. And once someone awakens, they're no longer so easy to control. Now, the choice is yours. Will you simply close this video and go on with your life as if nothing has changed? Or will you start seeking for yourself, questioning, investigating, and freeing yourself from the packaged version handed to you since childhood? Which of these books shocked you the most? Which one do you think deserves to be read again? Drop a comment below. I want to know what this content stirred within you. And of course, if this made you see things with new eyes, subscribe to the channel, turn on the notifications, and stay with us, because here, you don't just hear stories. You rebuild your vision of the world.